I mean, I had this guy's. He left the screen. I pressed start on him. That's not good. Not nice of me. Hey, mate, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm just grabbing something for my daughter real quick.
Yeah. No, go for it.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm well. Well, it's actually just early afternoon down here.
Oh, that's right. Well,
Yeah.
so I want to keep this informal as possible.
Yeah, go for it.
And I want to start off with thanking everybody watching, and I'd really like to thank you. I scrolled through your Facebook, and I creeped it a little bit, and it's a privilege of mine to debate with you. I myself competed in some regional and got to nationals, but it was like a first round knockout kind of thing.
Oh, so you see, I've been to like worlds and stuff, or?
Yes, I was. The privilege to debate with you, and I've seen your other debates, and I know you're astoundingly good. So, so I'm gonna start this off real quick. I'm gonna start off with there was my ethos statement, so we'll run from there. I'd like to give off some definitions real quick. Late capitalism. That's 1945 and onward. That's really where we're gonna maintain the discussion. And masculinity. So, defining masculinity is probably one of the hardest things we could do because culture to culture, there's really a difference in how people perceive masculinity. And there's a guy, Jack Donovan. I'm not a huge fan of most of his work, but his work in masculinity is something that I find refreshing because he's really done a large-scale amalgamation and boiling it down and unpacking it into what he calls the 4 tactical virtues of masculinity. And those are what I'm going to use for the definition of masculinity. So those are going to be strength, courage, mastery, and honor. And I think throughout any culture, men, for the most part, can agree to this. And I want to preface this debate that this debate isn't about how much facts one can throw or anything to that nature, but it's strictly about who can argue this topic better.
Sorry, guys, I didn't mean for you to leave. Sorry. I didn't mean for you to leave. Do you guys have a pen? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you stick around. Yeah. Sorry, I had some background. Yeah. I 100% agree. Can I just ask? Sorry. With your definitions, can I ask you to clarify? First thing, when you say 1945 onwards, can you perhaps offer the actual features of late capitalism which distinguish it from capitalism as opposed to like kind of a date stamp?
Well, so when people use late capitalism, it's a neo-Marxist term.
Right.
That really doesn't signify anything, but that it's from 1945 onwards in the West. Really, it's like the implication of how it is like a limited stage rather than a permanent one. It's really not a definitive statement. The reason why I stated late capitalism is that way everybody can wrap the conversation around 1945 and onwards for the West.
Okay. So it basically, the debate from your perspective basically is capitalism has destroyed masculinity, and please don't use any examples from before 1945.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool.
I think I can lay that out.
The other thing with so your features of masculinity, which you pointed out, were was it strength, courage, honor,
and mastery,
and mastery. And like I imagine stuff like loyalty probably is like a subsection of honor.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right, go for it. Give us your prop.
Okay. So I want to preface this debate as to why I think this is important. This will be my warrant. So I've always viewed masculinity as something that's been under attack, especially in the past 5 years as an American going to college and as an older male who's a stay-at-home dad. Where I've had many odd looks from men and women based on my taking care of my daughter and things. And I was listening to a talk about Fight Club, right? So the dichotomy of the extreme feminine man and the hyper masculine man. And this will go into my first contention. I'm going to roll into it from there. So my contention one is consumerism. If we look at how Fight Club shows the consumerism of the feminine man to create the dichotomy within Come on, baby. Give me a minute. It destroys the incentives of the man to be a man, and the push against it would be the hypermasculine Tyler Durden. So if we look at it from the male psyche point of view, in 1945 we've seen the increase in women working, and we've seen the increase of modern feminism, where the idea of the male breadwinner, the hunter-gatherer, really being took out of the equation and moving back into to an equal relationship. And I think that consumerism has led men to stray away from those four virtues, because it's not a tribe of men, whereas now we are more a family society, whereas pre-civilization it was based on getting a group of men together and being able to go hunt. My second contention is push against masculinity. Now, I think a lot of people view masculinity as a social construct, and to some extent, you can pull the schema and the hierarchy out from under those. And I would like to point to YouGov real quick. So YouGov has what's called the decline of traditional masculinity, and it's a scale where men are asked how masculine and how feminine they feel. In age 65 plus, men feel that they are 65% of men find themselves to be absolutely masculine, whereas currently in America, 18 to 29 is 30% of men find themselves extremely masculine or completely masculine. Now, if we look at Great Britain, it's at 28% of completely masculine. So I think that pulling out that schema out from men into what is and what isn't masculine has also created, and I think that's led on by late capitalism's push from neo-Marxists and the Frankfurt School. Contention 3: testosterone in men has steadily declined over the past
What are you doing up there? I thought I'd make my grand appearance up here. Don't worry, I'll fly right down. Here I come.
I'm sorry.
Wow, Twilight, you really done up. Look at all those tumors. Give me 1 second.
Okay, so testosterone has declined for the past 2 decades, according to Thomas G. Travison, PhD, in a study that's on the endocrine.org website that everybody can look up. It's the NERI team.
Yep.
So, and I go back to this tribalism of men and back to the 4 virtues of masculinity. The 4 virtues of masculinity are under attack here, as we've moved ourselves away from the tribalism of men due to the consumerism, the push against masculinity, and the drop of testosterone, all conglomerate into the destruction of masculinity and caused by late capitalism.
Right. So do you want me to chuck out some rebuttals to those premises?
Yes.
All right, cool. So first point, consumerism. You said that it destroys the incentives of men to be men. How does it do that? So in my mind, consumerism, all it does is it services needs which people want, right? So if people want to buy things, then the market services them. It doesn't necessarily infer that men will want to be men less. If anything, it actually services the desire of men to be men in other ways, right? So for example, you see things like pro wrestling and sports becoming massively popular. That's because there's a huge desire for men to put their masculinity on display. So it seems that consumerism actually fosters an environment where it allows men to participate in voluntary exchanges, where they do things like participate in sports games or like participate in things, like this, like debate, and then also rewards them by offering prize incentives, and also then puts that on display, which I think is another kind of aspect of masculinity. It's an identity which is publicly betrayed. So it seems that consumerism it does as much to service the needs of masculinity as it does to reduce incentives to be one. Maybe you could be more precise on the warrant as to what the incentives to be a man are, and to why consumerism takes away from them. The second premise you brought out was the idea that women working reduces masculinity. I think this is a good point. The idea that as women enter the workplace more, then maybe it reduces the need for men to. But I actually think that the logic behind why capitalism incentivizes women to be in the workplace is one which says that capitalism wants to mobilize as much labor as possible to extract as much profit as possible, But what that actually means is that pressure to work more applies to men and women. So obviously when women weren't working at all, the difference in work was much easier to achieve, right? Like you go from mobilizing zero labor of women to mobilizing tons, but that also applies incentives on men to work more as well. So for example, to refer to your virtues, mastery definitely goes up, right? Because as capitalism encourages people to work more in order to extract more profit, their mastery of the thing they're working at goes up. And then it would also, as you put increased competition into the workplace, right? Because you're now competing with men and women and more men working more, the requirement for you to embody your virtues like strength and courage and honor also increases, because now you're in a workplace where you're competing with other people for those things as well. Unless you can prove that there's something about the workplace which disencourages masculinity and encourages people to compete on other virtues, I think that the effect of more competition in the workplace is actually that people just have to do the thing which makes them good more, which would actually foster masculinity rather than destroy it. Third point you brought out was about the decline in reported masculinity. I have two responses. The first thing is that I actually think that those sorts of like how masculine people feel might be subject to things like social desirability bias. And because I think that particularly in you're talking about on college campuses, masculinity has recently picked up somewhat of a pejorative term, particularly amongst the young. So even men who feel particularly masculine might not self-report to be so because they don't want to be seen as part of a toxic masculinity culture. And so I wouldn't rely on those results. Whereas, for example, older people who aren't part of that culture might just be honest. But the other thing as well is that even if it was true, I don't see how it's linked to like capitalism. So if anything, it seems to me that the anti-masculine culture as to how, you know, people don't want to be masculine anymore seems to be more linked to specifically, as you're talking about, neo-Marxist cultural pushes, which absolutely the opposite of capitalism. The idea that everything's a social construct and that if only we could engineer if only we could engineer a situation by which everyone was equal, everyone turned out to be the same, is antithetical to capitalism. Because capitalism is premise one, everyone has different desires. Premise two, the market serves them, and thus you can make profit out of people's desires. Whereas the idea that the neo-Marxist one is that no, that, you know, the world around us is shaping our desires and we're all blank slates. If only, you know, the government could do more. So it seems to me that the push against masculinity is not coming from capitalism; it's coming from the other direction. And the last point you brought out about the testosterone is declining over the past 2 decades. I would just say that there's nothing linking that to like capitalism. Like I think you do. So in Australia we call them mechanisms, not warrants. But yeah, I want to know your warrant as to why like how capitalism has gotten into our biology and then made us produce less testosterone. So I think you're lacking a bit of a mech or warrant there. Right, so that's my rebuttal to all the four things. I guess my substantive is kind of integrated, right? That in my mind, capitalism fosters more competition and it also services needs in the marketplace. And I reckon that there is something inherent about like guys which makes them want to be masculine. So the market will service that need, but also as more people enter the marketplace, the requirement for people to, you know, actually outperform each other will lead to, I guess, increased amount, like, you know, increased displays of masculinity where it matters, not destruction of it. Yep. All right. Over back to you. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Yeah. So definitely good point that I'm not bringing my warrants together with my data and my claims. So let me try to go back over this and bring this together. So when I was specifically talking about consumerism, really I linked my first and my second as my first main contention, which bringing women into the workforce. And what I talked about, what I didn't hit on enough, is the dominance hierarchy between men and women, right? And I don't mean that as like a patriarchal society or anything like that. For there to be a dominance hierarchy, there has to be a reason for a dominance hierarchy. And with women working, it reduces men's dominance in the force. And we can take this and look at this, the decline in men in college, whereas there's an increase in women in college, where I think it's something close to 60-40, 60% women, 40% men. This reduces women's ability to find mates, and that attacks the dominance hierarchy that I'm talking about. Secondly, when we talk about in the workplace, you said it brings about competition in the workplace. Possibly in the beginning it did, But when we go back to those neo-Marxist claims and those pushes against toxic masculinity, a lot of normal masculine attributes, if we go back to strength, courage, mastery, and honor, they're really being pushed against. So having those in the workplace and showing those off is actually a net negative for men in the workplace. So that competition, that the boost that they would gain from the competition is actually reduced by the very same factor. Secondly, the push against masculinity. How do I tie that into late capitalism? I think late capitalism has fostered neo-Marxism because late capitalism destroyed normal Marxism, communism, and fascism for the most part up until here recently. So in doing so, the socialists, the communists had to move to another direction, whereas they couldn't hold really the economics against against capitalism. So they tried to attack the foundation, which would be the traditional relationship between the masculinity and the femininity. Now, if we can look at the femininity as an oppressed class, we can attack masculinity. And since men are the breadwinners, even now, attacking that and destroying the masculine would reap much worse effects than it would be to attack the feminine. And that is created by late capitalism, because late capitalism solely defeated communism and Marxism. And the third one, testosterone. I didn't touch on this enough, but testosterone is directly linked to the tribal mindset of men. They did a study where they took men in prison and soldiers deployed, right? Infantry units deployed and men in prison. And they controlled that group versus a group of civilian men. What they had found is that men in prison, men deployed with other men, and men around other men more often have higher levels of testosterone. In our normal consumerist manifestation of life and the easier life that we have, you're not around men as much as before. And this goes back to whether you're in college mainly with women. If you're in the workplace, you're having to battle more women in the workplace than you would men. So there's that bringing of estrogen in the workplace that will reduce the testosterone. And when we go strictly to walking down the street, since it's 50-50, rarely do you see men past the age of 25 walk around with a bunch of their friends. It's typically a young man's game to have a lot of friends, and that will cause the decline in testosterone, especially when men hit 30, which is really our main boost to strength, testosterone, and those things. So that's how I tie to those in. And real quick, I'm gonna let you go, but to the competition, I think I touched on the competition statement and the market service. So yes, the market will service anything it needs, but if you have a cultural and societal action against what the market will need, it's very hard for the market to allocate the resources for that. That's one of the few market failures that you will get.
Right. Alrighty. So cool. Let's go from the start. So consumerism. Okay. So basically, to step through what you're saying as more women enter the workplace, it changes the nature of the dominance hierarchy and creates a new one. I think that what you haven't proven though is that the presence of women in the workplace necessarily feminizes the workplace in a way which would destroy masculinity. What I think you'll probably find is that many women probably feel that actually the workplace is still sufficiently masculine, such that the sorts of women who end up making it to the top actually end up emulating masculinity more. And that's, for example, obviously a lot of these examples are quite anecdotal, but you hear a lot of you hear a lot of the stuff about, like, whenever, for example, the neo-Marxist school of thought, or even just the progressive school of thought gets out and starts saying why we need more cultural feminism in the workplace. What they're talking about is the idea that many workplaces are still built on the qualities which are seen to be desired are the masculine ones, right? So actually a good example of this, which has got a lot of data behind it, is the way in which people negotiate for wages. So one of the reasons as to why, for example, women tend to get pay rises less than men is because they just don't fight as aggressively for them, you know, in tough negotiating with bosses. And like, you know, some people would say that's fine, that's just like the way in which people negotiate, and other people would say no, this is because pay negotiations are occurring in a gendered paradigm which discriminates against women. But regardless of which one you think is correct, what it shows is that there is a, like, the idea of being strong and being, like, you know, able to speak and advocate for yourself, which, if we take your premises of which the virtues of masculinity, strength and courage and stuff, like, that's still valued by the workplace, even though women are in it. So the presence of women in the workplace does not necessarily infer the feminization of that workplace, but if anything, it seems that capitalism is still the force which like, you know, values the traditional things you're talking about, like strength and courage. So yeah, there's a little bit more, a few more links need to be done in your warrant there. As for the presence of women in college, like, so again, I'm just not really getting the link to, like, capitalism, and this is probably a bit of a culture divide because in Australia, college is free. It's not free, but it's like on an interest-free debt. So the forces of capitalism don't really act on college enrollments very much because it's like, you know, there's no price signals because, like, in Australia, HECS debt, no one actually ever thinks about it when they enroll in a course, because you don't even have to pay it off if you don't make a huge amount of money. To the extent which college enrollments are influenced by capitalism, if anything, it's just that whatever jobs are necessary, people go into those college degrees because they get, you know, they get paid more. But I don't see why that necessarily would reduce the amount of, like, quote unquote masculinity in the college. If anything, I think the source of what you're talking about is what you identified next, right? The idea that there's massive cultural forces which are trying to, you know, which are pointing to aspects of masculinity which they deem to be problematic, and, you know, upping femininity. But that's not capitalism, right? Like that's just a, you know, that's an ideology. And, you know, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with whether it's correct, that it's the presence of the ideology, and which I think you identified in many cases as neo-Marxist, but in other cases could just be progressive. Like that's the source of it. So yeah, and the way in which you met that was, you said that, like, you identified the way it works in the neo-Marxist paradigm is that you identify hierarchies of oppression, and you say that femininity is being oppressed by masculinity, therefore masculinity is bad. That's got nothing to do with, like, capitalism. And the only reason which you said that it was is that because capitalism defeated the other ones in the aftermath of the Second World War, therefore it is responsible to everything afterwards. Well, that's certainly not true, right? Like, you know, you could have, for example, capitalism triumph as the dominant paradigm in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then have other ideologies kind of spring out from under the weeds and try and take, like, over capitalism. That doesn't make capitalism responsible for those things. If anything, it is the only thing fighting against them. So it seems to me that a lot of the stuff you're talking about, whilst it's, you know, correct in, you know, like, you're correct in identifying certain cultural forces which are discouraging masculinity nowadays, what you haven't done is link them to capitalism. Instead, I think what you have done successfully is link them to things like neo-Marxism. The last thing I'll talk about quickly is the testosterone. Oh, sorry, I've also got the competition. Second last thing, testosterone. So you talked about how it's done between prisons. The first thing I'd say there is that what you've shown is that a prison environment encourages large amounts of testosterone. What you haven't done is shown that testosterone is inherently linked to the virtues of masculinity as you describe them. So I can certainly get that men who are, like, abnormally high in testosterone might be higher in strength, but I don't see necessarily any increase in things like honor, loyalty, and masculinity. You know, so for example, men who are very high in testosterone tend to be more aggressive and actually tend to break, you know, honor codes a lot, and, you know, tend to be courageous in the wrong ways. So it seems to me that if you have abnormally high amounts of testosterone, that doesn't actually necessarily lead to the virtuous masculinity which you set up as your premise for today, but also doesn't seem to be linked to capitalism, because, for example, prisons are state apparatuses, right? Like they're there to as a tool of government control, not necessarily as a tool of capitalist control. So I don't see how it's linked to, like, capitalism. But the other thing you're talking about is the market, is the competition in the market, and you correctly identified that the market only services needs, but if there's no cultural if there's no cultural desire for those things, then the market doesn't service them. But I think ultimately what this points to is that capitalism just reflects what the culture, like, wants, right? It doesn't have a hand in influencing what it is. What you need to show is that the presence of capitalism and the market mechanisms at play actually reduce the desire for masculinity. It's possible that like they actually are completely ambivalent, right? That capitalism just sits back and says, whatever the culture's got, I'll just emulate it. But that doesn't show that capitalism has destroyed the masculinity. That just shows that culture has, and capitalism is just reflecting the desire of culture. I would say that probably a more accurate picture would be that capitalism serves production, and production is served well by some of the virtues which you talked about, things like strength and mastery. And as long as capitalism is present, then it'll continue to value those things, even despite culture. Yeah, so those would be my responses, and I'll toss it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Great, great. So, back to, I hate to beat down the same terms again, but so the dominance hierarchy that I'm really trying to talk about is a psychological manifestation of the paradigm between masculinity and femininity, but it's also the paradigm between men. So I just want to make that clear. And then the competition, the destruction of masculinity, where in the workforce and in college and things like that, you said there might be a cultural difference between that. Possibly, but I think it's pretty well known throughout most of the West that women are in college more, or taking over more higher paying jobs and these things. Don't get me wrong, there's still a glass wall in some instances, but for the most part, women are dominating in most of these issues. So the big thing that I've got here is I really need to prove how capitalism or late capitalism intertwines with all of my points. But before I do that, I really want to talk about the link between testosterone. You said that it leads to higher aggression, and that the courage may not be in a proper way. That's really an archaic view of testosterone, something that's akin to the whole debate about steroids causing roid rage and things of that nature. That's not true. So what steroids, and I'm going to use steroids as an analogy. So steroids, increase your testosterone levels, and a lot of people thought that these guys that were taking steroids, they were getting these strange roid rage due to the high level of testosterone. What it comes to find out is that these were basic, what you would consider beta males. These guys did not have alpha male type personalities. And when they gained these attributes, these physical attributes, it threw off their dominance hierarchy. And so for them to project mentally what they are physically, they had to overreact. And this is been tested over and over. I can't link any studies right off the top of my head. But
I actually just looked it up. You're completely correct. Testosterone is not linked to aggression. I was wrong there.
Okay. And I only know that just because I had a debate not too long ago about testosterone.
Yeah. I think the bit which you still need to address, though, is that why prison, which is a state apparatus, is linked. Like why isn't that just prison is increasing it as opposed to like capitalism decreasing it? If that makes sense.
Okay, well, yeah, well, I use that as an analogy for the tribalism of men, whereas men in a group have higher level of testosterone. And that goes with servicemen overseas. So that was the link that I was trying to make there, is that in this late capitalism age, you don't see the same amount of men together as you did previously.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. So can I just clarify? So what you're saying is that as the workforce and college and stuff has become more integrated, the sexes have become therefore less segregated, and so the cycle of tribalism, between men is therefore decreasing, which is decreasing masculinity. Okay, that's an interesting point. Could I quickly point out there? Do you think perhaps what might also be happening though is that it just changes the emphasis of which virtue is important? So, for example, if you have a segregated like men and women tribe, strength probably becomes more important, because to reach the top of the dominance hierarchy between men, that is a more like, that's more competed over. But if you have men and women together, then things like honor and courage become more important, because now you're trying to show that you'd be like a suitable and loyal mate. But that, do you know what I mean? So it doesn't necessarily destroy masculinity. It just changes the way in which it should like present itself.
Yes. So a quick brief over where he come up with the ideas for the 4 virtues of masculinity. I think this will alleviate some of the question towards it. So strength, courage, mastery, and honor. The reason why those were the traits of masculinity is because those are traits you want when you go to war or you go to hunt. So you want the man to be strong. You want him to be courageous, where he'll take a bullet for his fellow man. You want the mastery, so that he's good with the bow, the gun, the spear. And the honor, that if you die, he will be able to continue take care of your family, or he's honorable, that he's not going to steal your mate when you're not looking, things of that nature. So those really boil down to some very localized sociobiological effects, and how those have been treated throughout history, and how they've been treated throughout all cultures, which is how he comes to that amalgamation. You can't have that. You can't have that. Give me 1 second. I gotta do something.
That's all right. That's all right.
Come here. What do you do with the straw? There you go. Okay, so really my link between the capitalism, because I got lost in what I was doing. So the link I have between capitalism and this is that the consumerism of capitalism and the integration, as you said, where capitalism is just trying to maximize everything that it can, maximize labor, maximize capital, optimize at one time. That has caused the decrease in testosterone, and that decrease in testosterone was really the main point I was going to drive. I changed my debate structure at the last minute because I was listening to that talk. But really, it's that drive down of testosterone, the drive down and away from male tribalism that's caused the falter in the 4 virtues, especially when it comes to strength. Strength training is not something that's really good. I mean, I think we've had what's called the Z era, where aesthetics became a much more important part of workouts rather than strength. Courage is not really a virtue of a man anymore, because most men don't view, I guess you could say, a classical version of courage. I will go out and fight the dragon, if I could use an archetypal. Mastery.
You're a Jordan Peterson fan?
Yes. He drove a lot of this too. So mastery. That's one of the big ones that I want to point out, because like guys go to these days, especially millennials. They say millennials, I think it's in 10 years they have 12 different jobs. You might want to fact check that, but I know something like.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
They have an unbelievably job switching persona, and I think that goes back to the point that mastery is not very important anymore. And then honor. I mean, I'm a traditional conservative, so what I consider honor and that virtue is honor of family, honor of friends, honor of, like, Mike Pence recently made the news because he said he wouldn't sit down with a woman without his wife. I find that honorable. I also find that a good idea, but I find it honorable that I wouldn't disrespect my wife in that manner, and I wouldn't want to disrespect another woman in that manner. Not because I'm tempted to sexually assault her, but because it's just rude, because my female has the need for me as the male structure in her life, and she is the female structure in my life. So I think that clears up some of the points I'm trying to make.
So I think the thing is though, is that the virtues which you're talking about are not just manifested in war. They're manifested in work, and they're manifested in being a father, right? Like, you need to have the strength, and not just physical, but also like the strength of character defend your family from any threats. You need to have the courage to stand up for you and to stand up for the people who are close to you. You have to have the honor and integrity and the loyalty to stick with your job or stick with your family to make sure it works. And you have to have the mastery. You have to be good at it, right? Because if you're a hopeless twit, then no one will want to hire you, or no one would want to be like romantically involved with you. So it just seems that even though those traits might have been conceptualized out of that war era, it seems like it's very easy for them to manifest themselves in the modern paradigms of being a father or of being of being an employee, and particularly being an employee, right? Like, so I like, you definitely need to be good at what you do. You definitely need to respect the integrity of the business. You definitely, like, the employees who are brave and stand up for themselves and show that they can be a proper ambassador for the company get rewarded, right? That those qualities are definitely rewarded. But I will concede that strength has become less necessary. Like, raw physical strength has been replaced by ability to mechanize labor and things like that. There are definitely still some professions localized where that is important, right? So, like, people like builders and tradies and stuff still need to have strength. But what I would say here is that if you can imagine these four virtues, what I think is that some of the later ones have become more important as the early ones have become less important, right? So if you can imagine, using the example of a tradie, as being able to lift and carry objects has become less important, the ability to manipulate them with fine precision has become more important. So it's kind of like a trade-off between strength and mastery, rather than just a complete removal of the requirement of those characteristics altogether. And like, I don't see why, for example, like, a lot of the stuff you're talking about are cultural forces, right? They're actually forces who are anti-capitalist. Like, the people who, for example, say that Mike Pence is doing the wrong thing by refusing to dine with anyone else by his wife, are the same people who would say that global capitalism has failed us and say that they're fighting against it. So it seems to me that the forces of which you're talking about are specifically anti-capitalist cultural forces, and it is actually capitalism which still promotes the virtues of masculinity as you described it. I'll kick it back to you for some closing statements, because I think we've only got about like 4 minutes left each.
Yeah, we've only got a little bit of time. So I'd like to start off and thank you. This is, like I said, this is a good one. I figured it'd be a fun one for extemporaneous. It is,
Absolutely.
I ask everyone, if you're watching this, really do go watch this. It's called Fight Club, Masculinity in Modern Culture. It's a wonderful, wonderful 12-minute speech about it. The guy has a good voice, but he really breaks down Fight Club in a manner that I didn't, and I'm a huge fan of the books and of really the archetypal character of Tyler Durden. And so I want to point out my three contentions were consumerism and the destroying of the male psyche with women closed off the dominance hierarchy. The push against masculinity, how I explained how masculinity self-identified has lowered over time, and that testosterone in men has declined, and that's due to us removing ourselves from our tribalism, and how I tie all of this into capitalism. Is that, for one, I blame capitalism for defeating socialism and creating the Frankfurt School and creating the social Marxism that has slowly indoctrinated our youth, and it's come into created this dichotomy between masculinity and femininity. And next, I want to talk about his point, competition. The competition in the marketplace, I don't find that it's a sufficient enough point to gain anything on the four virtues of masculinity: strength, courage, mastery, and honor. Especially when we look at millennials and how they reduce themselves, not having jobs as often, leaving jobs, bad attitudes.
I'm not, but I won't stay forever because
and that's what the link between testosterone and male attitudes is something that severely underlooked and underrepresented in modern culture. And thank you very much. I'm going to let you have the final say.
Yep. Excellent. I'd also like to thank for this debate. It might be worth clarifying for all those watching. We kind of just agreed to do this on the fly, so both of us have come in real cold, just kind of making it up as we go, and I think we've given a good crack, all things considered. I'll just finish up by this. I would say that most of what my opponent's talking about is about the ways in which certain neo-Marxist cultural forces are reducing the value of masculinity. What I am not persuaded by is that that is linked to capitalism. The only link given has been that as capitalism, so there have been two. The first one is because capitalism defeated fascism and Marxism and everything in the past, therefore it is responsible for everything in the future. I disagree. I reckon that if you were to compare the world where capitalism lost that fight, those social Marxist forces would be even more powerful, because not only would they be trying to fight a cultural thing, they would have won the economic war as well. So what I think the reality is more that capitalism didn't totally defeat those forces. It defeated them in an economic way and it defeated them in the war, but didn't defeat them culturally completely. And that's why they're coming back and manifesting themselves now. And so, and I think that one of the things which they're fighting against, and one of the things which is trying to preserve the traditional values, is capitalism. Is something that says we don't care what your social cultural ideas are. We care about how good you are at your job. That's mastery. We care about how much you respect the company of the integrity of our company. That's honor. We care about how willing you are to put yourself out there and represent us. That's courage. So I think that generally speaking, even though I agree that the presence of cultural forces is definitely trying to attack these virtues, I think that those things are not coming from capitalism. They're in fact coming from other social forces. Whether you agree with them or not doesn't really matter. They're just coming from those social forces, and capitalism is fighting against that. The second reason which he gave was the idea of as you know, men socialize differently. They socialize between themselves, and that leads to higher testosterone and higher emphasis on things like strength, as opposed to when they socialize in more integrated communities. What I would say there is that I definitely agree that changes the expression of masculinity, but I don't think it destroys it. By which I mean there is, I think it means that things like honor become more important in a more gender integrated environment, and things like strength become less important. But that doesn't mean that it's less masculine. There is more. You can be masculine by being very courageous and honorable and having mastery of your craft without necessarily being that strong. And so I think it changes the expression of masculinity without necessarily destroying it. And then the last thing I would say is that my substantive points I would say, generally speaking, marketplaces will always reward the sorts of things which honor production, and they will always feed people's desires. I think there is an innate desire for some men to be masculine, and the market will always serve that. And that's why you see things like sports being so popular. And the sorts of people who are sports heroes are the ambassadors of things like strength, and are the ambassadors of good team players, things like honor and courage, and are the masters of their sports. And I think that's not going away anytime soon. And I think the presence of women in the workplace, and the presence of, like, you know, women in college and stuff, is just making, I don't think that necessarily feminizes those areas. I think that lots of those women claim that actually they're having to masculize themselves to compete. And I think at the end of the day, more competition means that the men have to do better at what they're doing, which means, you know, embody their virtues more, and it's cutting out those who are kind of who were previously over there because they were men. So if anything, the competition in the workplace actually increases the requirement for those men to be properly masculine and embody those virtues better, and thus not destroying masculinity. But all in all, look, I think we had a good debate. I think people could definitely watch this and maybe offer some thoughts and stuff, and maybe we'll have another discussion in the future. But yeah, it was good debating you.
It's great debating you. You have a great day.